The American Southwest was once a land of flowing water, but by the turn of the 21st century, it was becoming a place of dust and memory. The sun beat down on soil that was as hard and cracked as old pottery. Rivers that once carved paths through the landscape had dwindled to mere trickles or vanished altogether, leaving behind wide, empty channels of sand and rock. The plants that held the soil together withered away, and with them, the insects, birds, and mammals that depended on them. This wasn't just a dry spell, it was a deep systemic sickness. The land was losing its ability to hold on to life, its very heartbeat growing faint and weak. Ecologists and land managers felt a growing sense of desperation. They tried everything they could think of to heal the wounds. They planted thousands of saplings along the barren riverbanks, hoping to recreate the lush corridors of green that once existed. They built artificial structures like rock dams and log weirs to try and slow the little water that remained. These efforts were noble and expensive, but they were like placing a small bandage on a massive injury. The saplings often died from thirst, and the man-made dams were frequently washed away by the rare but powerful flash floods that tore through the canyons. The problem was too big, too fundamental for human engineering alone to solve. The land's memory of water was fading. The deep underground aquifers, which are like natural water storage tanks, were not being refilled. Without the slow, steady soak of water from healthy rivers, they were being pumped dry for towns and agriculture. This created a vicious cycle. As the groundwater dropped, the remaining river water would sink into the ground and disappear even faster. The land was caught in a downward spiral, becoming hotter, drier, and less hospitable with each passing year. The people working to save it knew they were losing the battle. They needed a new ally, something that understood the land's ancient rhythms in a way they did not. This crisis was a quiet one, happening far from major cities in the vast open spaces of states like Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. But its consequences were profound. It affected the ranchers whose cattle struggled to find water, the small towns whose wells were running low, and the delicate web of wildlife teetering on the brink of collapse. The experts looked at their charts and models, and the future looked bleak. They needed a miracle, a game changer that could work at the scale of the ecosystem itself. What they didn't realize was that the solution they so desperately needed had been there all along, waiting for a chance to return. The answer wasn't in new technology, but in a furry, flat-tailed rodent. Into this landscape of despair came a wild, almost laughable idea. A small group of scientists and conservationists proposed a radical solution. They didn't suggest a new type of dam or a more resilient tree. They suggested beavers, not just a few, but thousands of them. The idea was to capture beavers from areas where they were plentiful or even considered pests and release them into these dying desert river systems. They wanted to parachute in an army of buck-toothed engineers and let them get to work. This was not a plan that was easily accepted. It seemed illogical, like trying to put out a fire with a squirt gun. The proposal was met with deep skepticism, and for good reason. How could an animal known for living in lush, water-rich forests possibly survive, let alone thrive, in a desert? The riverbeds were often bone dry for most of the year. The cottonwood and willow trees that beavers rely on for food and building materials were scarce or completely gone. To many experts, it sounded like a recipe for failure, a cruel and pointless experiment that would only lead to the demise of the relocated animals. They envisioned the beavers wandering aimlessly in the dust, searching for water and wood that simply wasn't there. It felt like a fantasy, disconnected from the harsh reality of the environment. The champions of the idea, however, saw things differently. They believed that the experts had the cause and effect backward. The land wasn't dry because beavers couldn't live there. Beavers couldn't live there because they had been removed. For centuries, trappers had hunted beavers to near extinction across North America for their valuable pelts. These proponents argued that the beavers weren't just inhabitants of wet places. They were the creators of wet places. Their very presence, their instinctual drive to build dams, was the missing ingredient needed to kickstart the entire ecosystem's recovery. They believed that if you just gave the beavers a chance, a mere trickle of water was all they would need. So the plan moved forward, not as a massive government-funded project, but as a series of small, daring experiments. Led by groups like the Bureau of Land Management and Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources, teams began identifying suitable, albeit degraded, locations. They would use live traps to capture entire beaver families, parents and their young kids, to keep their social structures intact. These families would then be transported, sometimes hundreds of miles, to their new barren homes. It was a huge gamble, an act of faith in the power of a single species to reverse a century of decline. The fate of these desert rivers now rested on the shoulders of these furry, unwitting pioneers. To understand why this wild idea had any chance of success, one must first understand the beaver itself. A beaver is not just an animal that lives near water, it is an animal that manipulates its environment to create the perfect home. Its entire biology is a toolkit for aquatic engineering. Its large, sharp incisors, which are coated in iron to make them strong and orange, can fell a 6-inch wide willow tree in minutes. Its broad, flat, scaly tail acts as a rudder for swimming and a prop to balance on while it chews on trees. Its webbed hind feet are powerful paddles for moving through the water, making it an incredibly efficient swimmer. The driving force behind all this activity is a deep, instinctual need for safety. Beavers are clumsy and vulnerable on land, but they are graceful and secure in the water. Their primary goal is to create deep ponds where they can escape from predators like coyotes, bears, and mountain lions. They build lodges, which are like fortified castles made of mud and sticks, with underwater entrances that keep them safe. To create these deep water refuges, beavers build dams. The sound of running water triggers an irresistible urge in a beaver to plug the source of this sound. They will work tirelessly, night after night, to stop the flow. This is how they work their magic. A beaver family will start by chewing down small trees and branches, dragging them into the creek and lodging them into the stream bed. They push them into the mud and anchor them with rocks. Then, they weave smaller branches and sticks into this foundation, creating a sturdy lattice. The final step is to plaster the upstream side of the dam with mud, stones, and aquatic vegetation. This makes the dam watertight. The result is a barrier that slows the flow of water, causing it to back up and form a pond. This pond is their sanctuary, their pantry, and their nursery all in one. Many scientists in the Southwest were doubtful because they believed the desert streams lacked the necessary materials. They saw no large trees for building and assumed the infrequent but powerful flash floods would destroy any small dam a beaver could build. What they underestimated was the beaver's resourcefulness. Beavers are adaptable. If large trees aren't available, they will use smaller shrubs, reeds, and even tumbleweeds. They are persistent engineers who don't follow a human blueprint. They work with what the land gives them, and their constant maintenance makes their structures surprisingly resilient. This innate, relentless drive to build was the very force the desert was waiting for. The first relocations were small and carefully monitored, almost like a proof of concept. In places like the Price River watershed in Utah, teams released a few beaver families into creeks that were little more than seasonal ditches. The initial moments were filled with tension. The beavers, released from their transport cages, would often hesitate before slipping into the shallow, murky water of their new home. For the first few days, there was little activity. The scientists and land managers watched and waited, hoping their faith was not misplaced. They wondered if the skeptics were right, if the animals would simply give up and disappear. Then, slowly but surely, the engineering began. It started with a single branch laid across the narrowest point of the creek, then another and another. Working under the cover of darkness, the beavers started to construct their first small dam. It wasn't a mighty structure like those seen in northern forests, but a modest dam made from willows, sagebrush, and mud. Almost immediately, a small puddle of water began to form behind it. This tiny pond, perhaps only a few feet across, was the first victory. It was a sign that the beavers' ancient instincts had kicked in. The sound of trickling water had been silenced. What happened next was astonishingly fast. The first small pond slowed the water, allowing more of it to soak into the dry, thirsty ground. This underground saturation encouraged the growth of a few willow and sedge shoots along the new waterline. As these plants grew, they provided the beavers with more food and more building materials. With these new resources, the beavers expanded their first dam and started building a second one just downstream, then a third. Within a single season, a section of creek that had been a dry, incised gully was transformed into a series of stepped ponds, like a watery staircase descending through the desert. This process created a self-reinforcing loop of restoration. Each new pond raised the local water table, which in turn watered the banks of the stream, leading to an explosion of green leafy vegetation. What was once a thin brown line of decay was becoming a wide, lush green ribbon of life. the pilot projects were a stunning success. The beavers were not just surviving, they were thriving and dramatically reshaping the landscape far faster than any human-led effort ever could. The initial trickle of beaver relocations was about to become a steady flow, as the success of these first colonies provided the evidence needed to expand the program across the region. The rapid transformation of the landscape left the scientific community in a state of stunned amazement. Researchers who had initially dismissed the idea as wishful thinking were now visiting these sites and, honestly, seeing the changes with their own eyes. They had predicted the beavers would fail, that the dams would wash out with the first flood. Instead, what they saw was that the series of beaver dams worked together to diffuse the energy of floodwaters. Each pond acted as a speed bump, slowing the water down and preventing the destructive erosion that had plagued the man-made structures. The beavers had built a system that was not only effective, but also resilient and self-healing. For the local ranchers and farmers, the change was nothing short of a miracle. Many had been initially wary of the beaver reintroduction, worried the animals would damage their irrigation systems or cut down valuable trees. But their fears quickly turned to joy. They saw creeks that had been dry for as long as they could remember begin to flow year-round. The new wetlands created by the beavers acted like giant sponges, storing water from spring melts and monsoon rains, and releasing it slowly throughout the dry summer months. This meant more reliable water for their livestock and a healthier range for grazing. The beavers were not pests. They were the best water managers they had ever had. The return of water and plants brought with it a symphony of other life. The newly formed ponds and marshes became magnets for biodiversity. Songbirds, once absent from the silent, dry canyons, returned in droves, their songs filling the air. Their nests dotted the new willow thickets. Ducks and other waterfowl began using the ponds as stopover points during their long migrations. Frogs and salamanders, whose life cycles depend on standing water, reappeared in astounding numbers. Deer and elk were drawn to the lush vegetation for forage, and the predators that hunt them were not far behind. The entire food web was being rewoven, thread by thread. The project became a living classroom. University students and researchers flocked to the beaver restoration sites to study the incredible ecological revival. They measured water flow, catalogued plant species, and tracked animal populations. The data they collected provided hard evidence for what was visibly obvious. The beavers were healing the land on a massive scale. The initial skepticism had completely evaporated, replaced by a sense of wonder and a newfound respect for nature's own engineers. The project was no longer a fringe experiment. It was becoming a celebrated model for large-scale ecosystem restoration. The most immediate and obvious impact of the beavers was on the water itself, but the benefits rippled outwards in ways no one had fully anticipated. The series of dams and ponds did more than just keep water on the surface. They fundamentally changed how water interacted with the land. Before the beavers, rainwater and snowmelt would rush through the deep, straight channels, scouring the landscape and carrying away valuable topsoil. The water was there one day and gone the next, with very little of it having a chance to soak into the ground. It was honestly, an inefficient and destructive system. The beavers completely re-engineered this plumbing. Their dams slowed the water down, spreading it out across the valley floor. This gentle, slow-moving water dropped its sediment, which began to rebuild the eroded riverbeds. Over time, the deep gullies started to fill in, reconnecting the river with its historic floodplain. More importantly, this slow water had time to percolate deep into the earth, recharging the underground aquifers. This was a crucial benefit. It was like making regular deposits into the land's water savings account, ensuring a steady supply for the entire ecosystem, including the wells of nearby human communities. This process of water retention had a profound effect on the local climate. The new wetlands and lush vegetation released moisture into the air through a process called transpiration. This created a cooler, more humid microclimate along the river corridors. On a hot summer day, the temperature in a beaver-restored canyon could be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than in a nearby dry canyon. This cooling effect reduced stress on plants and animals and made the area more resilient to the increasing heat brought on by climate change. The beavers were essentially building natural air conditioning units for the desert. Furthermore, the beaver ponds became incredibly effective at improving water quality. As the stream flowed through the series of ponds, The slow-moving water allowed sediment, nutrients, and even pollutants to settle out and be broken down by aquatic plants and microbes. The water flowing out of a beaver complex was significantly cleaner than the water flowing into it. The beavers created natural water treatment plants that functioned for free 24 hours a day. They were not only bringing water back to the desert, but they were also making that water cleaner, cooler, and more reliable for everyone and everything that depended on it. The story of the beavers' success is best told through the eyes of the people who live on the land. Take Jay Wild, a rancher in Idaho whose family had ranched on Birch Creek for generations. He watched the creek on his property dry up, turning his lush meadows into sagebrush flats. He spent a fortune on restoration projects that failed. Finally, in desperation, he agreed to allow beavers onto his land. Within a few years, the creek was flowing again, the ponds were full of trout, and his meadows were green. He went from a beaver skeptic to one of their most passionate advocates, telling anyone who would listen, "We didn't have a water problem, we had a beaver problem, we didn't have any." Then there are the scientists, like Dr. Carol Evans, a hydrologist who spent years studying these systems. She recalls her initial disbelief followed by a career-changing realization. She and her students would go out to measure the water table by monitoring wells drilled at various distances from the creek. In areas without beavers, the wells were often dry, but in the beaver-restored areas, they found water just a few feet below the surface, even at the height of summer. For her students, it was a powerful, tangible lesson in ecosystem function. They weren't just reading about hydrology in a textbook, they were seeing a landscape come back to life before their very eyes. Local officials also saw the benefits firsthand. A forest ranger in Utah described the change in one particular canyon. Before the beavers, it was a place people avoided, hot, dry, and uninviting. After a beaver colony established itself, it became a local treasure. Families would come to picnic by the ponds, watch the wildlife, and enjoy the cool green shade. It became a recreational asset for the community, boosting local morale, and even bringing in a small amount of tourism. The ranger noted that the beavers had done more to improve that part of the forest in 5 years than his agency had managed in 50. Even the smallest voices noticed the change. A group of elementary school students on a field trip to a restored creek were asked what they saw. One child, who had visited the same spot a year earlier, pointed to the water and said, "It's not running away anymore." In that simple, profound observation lies the entire secret to the beavers' success. They taught the water how to stay. These personal stories from ranchers, scientists, rangers, and children paint a vivid picture of a community rediscovering its connection to the land and learning to trust in the wisdom of its original engineers. One of the most surprising and vital benefits of beaver reintroduction emerged as the West began to face a new and terrifying threat: megafires. As climate change led to hotter, drier conditions, wildfires grew larger, more intense, and more destructive than ever before. They incinerated vast landscapes, leaving behind a blackened, sterile world. Yet, within these charred expanses, researchers began to notice something extraordinary. They saw patches and long corridors of vibrant green that had somehow resisted the flames. When they looked closer, they discovered that these fire-resistant oases were almost always beaver wetlands. The network of dams, ponds, and water-saturated soil created by beavers acts as a natural firebreak. The high moisture content in the soil and the lush, green, non-flammable vegetation of the wetlands simply refuse to burn. While a raging wildfire might consume the dry forest on the surrounding hillsides, it would often stop dead in its tracks when it reached the edge of a beaver complex. The fire would either have to burn around the wet area or would simply fizzle out from the lack of dry fuel. In a fire-prone landscape, these beaver-created wetlands are zones of safety. This discovery has profound implications. During a wildfire, these green refuges, or fire refugia, provide a sanctuary for wildlife. Birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians can shelter in the wet, cool environment until the fire passes. After the fire, these surviving populations can then spread out and begin the slow process of recolonizing the burned landscape. The beaver wetlands are not just fire breaks, they are lifeboats that preserve biodiversity through the catastrophe of a fire. They ensure that the process of recovery can begin almost immediately, rather than taking decades or centuries. After a fire, the damage continues. The loss of vegetation on the hillsides leads to massive erosion and mudslides when the rains come. Ash and sediment choke the rivers, killing fish and contaminating water supplies for downstream communities. But here again, the beavers play a heroic role. The beaver dams in the valleys below the burned areas act as nets, capturing the flood of post-fire debris. They slow the toxic runoff, allowing the sediment to settle and preventing it from polluting the entire watershed. They are not only protecting the land from fire, but also protecting it from the fire's aftermath, demonstrating a level of ecosystem service that is almost unbelievable. The story of the beavers in the American Southwest is more than just a tale about a clever rodent. It is a profound lesson in humility and a powerful blueprint for hope. For decades, we approached ecosystem restoration with human arrogance, believing that our own engineering and technology were the answer. We built concrete structures and planted neat rows of trees, trying to force the land to obey our commands. The results were often expensive, temporary, and disappointing. The desert taught us that we cannot impose our will on nature and expect success. We must instead listen to the land and work with its own processes. The beavers have shown us that nature's own engineers are often the most effective. They work for free, adapt to changing conditions, and create complex, resilient systems that provide a cascade of benefits we are only just beginning to understand. Reintroducing a keystone species like the beaver is a form of restoration that is self-sustaining. Once established, they manage the landscape themselves, creating a living, breathing system that heals itself. This approach, sometimes called process-based restoration, is about restarting the natural engines of an ecosystem and then stepping back to let them run. This success offers immense hope for other degraded landscapes around the world, especially as we face the growing challenges of climate change, desertification, and biodiversity loss. From the drylands of Spain to the cattle-compacted streams of Australia, there are countless places that could benefit from the return of their own keystone engineers, whether they be beavers or other ecosystem-shaping species. The lesson is universal. Find the missing piece, restore the critical natural process, and the ecosystem will begin to heal itself. It is a more patient, more observant, and ultimately more effective way of being stewards of our planet. In the end, the humble beaver has retaught us an ancient truth. We are not separate from nature, but a part of it. Our well-being is tied directly to the health of the ecosystems we inhabit. By bringing the beavers back to the desert, we did more than just restore a few creeks. We restored a relationship. We learned to trust in the resilience of life and the wisdom embedded in the wild. In a world searching for solutions to immense environmental problems, the beaver offers a simple, powerful, and hopeful path forward. Find nature's partners, give them a chance, and watch the world come back to life.